Hey everybody, my name's Tim, and thank you for joining us again. So today's program will be about the naming legacies of the Battle of Okinawa. But before we get into that, just wanted to tell you about our next upcoming lecture that we're hosting. That is going to be August 14th at noon. It will be about the USS Mississippi, the ship of manifest destiny. And that's going to be with John Corstein. That'll be pretty interesting. If you were with us on our last John Corstein program, he had talked about the demise of that ship, and this will be about the history of it all the way up to its conclusion in the Civil War. So, like always, we will be having a Q&A section at the end. So please feel free to go ahead and ask any questions you want Mark to answer for you today. And then if you could, click that subscribe button, like us, share us. That really does help promote the museum. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Mark.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me again. And I hope that this proves to be as interesting as the legacies of Iwo Jima turned out to be. Bring up the presentation. There we go. The Battle of Okinawa was an 82-day-long battle, and it lasted from the 1st of April to the 22nd of June, 1945. So again, 75th anniversary, and appropriate for us to be covering it as a topic here. A mixed Army and Marine Corps force of 250,000 men invaded the island of Okinawa, held by 96,000 Japanese and Okinawan troops. And this was a major logistical battle. Even though the island of Okinawa wasn't as isolated or water poor or resource poor as Iwo Jima was, the United States had to bring in almost all the resources it required to fight the battle, something that will get mentioned again. Again, brutal conflict, 200,000 casualties, deaths actually on the US side to 77,000 on the Japanese. And that's just for the military. The civilian population of Okinawa of 300,000 was unfortunately reduced by 50% as the result of this battle. Unlike Iwo Jima, Okinawa featured a major naval combat component known as the Typhoon of Steel, where the Japanese kamikazes targeted the American ships supporting and transporting the invasion forces. And it also resulted in the final destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Some of their last operable major combat units sortied in an attempt to reach Okinawa, but that particular operation was a major failure, resulting in the sinking of several Japanese ships, including the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Yamato. It is fitting then that the first ship we discuss is the USS Okinawa herself, LPH-3, an amphibious assault ship of the Iwo Jima class, built at Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, 11,000 tons, 667-man crew, capable of carrying 2,157 troops, as well as 25 helicopters. In service from 1962 until 1992, she was actually active almost immediately after her commission in the blockade for the Cuban Missile Crisis, but had some other interesting highlights to her career. Participated in the 1964 World's Fair in New York, deployed to the Dominican Republic during the 1965 Civil War, deployed to Vietnam, 1968, recovered, shown here, the Apollo 6 capsule, which was unmanned in 1968. As late as 1990, was doing humanitarian assistance in the Philippines for the recovery of a typhoon, and that was 1970 that it was in the Philippines helping recover from a typhoon. 1971, August 5th in August, helped with the recovery of Apollo 15, one of the manned moon landing programs, and very proud to say that my dad, Ernesto Nucup, was on the USS Okinawa for that particular recovery. In April 1975, was part of the evacuation force for Cambodia and Vietnam, which led to some very interesting circumstances as Vietnamese Air Force and military helicopters were flying out the USS Okinawa. There were so many of them landing on board that they eventually had to start pushing them over so that additional aircraft could land on the Okinawa. In 1987, was in the Persian Gulf supporting mine-sweeping operations. The mining of the Persian Gulf was actually a huge deal and was causing a lot of problems for oil tankers. And I think that mine warfare in the second half of the 20th century is a big untold story of the United States Navy. And in 1990 was back in the Gulf as part of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. After that, in 1992, the Okinawa was decommissioned and it was sunk as a target in 2002 off the coast of California. Moving to the ships named after individuals, the USS Courtney, in an active ship from 1956 into 1937, was a destroyer escort of the Dealey class. It was built at Defoe Shipbuilding in Michigan. 1,907 tons, 107 crew. It spent most of its warfare in anti-submarine warfare. It spent most of its career in anti-submarine warfare training and practiced convoy duty off of the East Coast. However, it did have an interesting highlight when it participated in Operation Argus, which was an atmospheric nuclear weapons test in the South Atlantic, which just sounds like that was a terrible idea. It was decommissioned in 1973 and sold for scrap in 1974. The namesake of the vessel was Major Henry Courtney Jr., who was born in 1916 in Duluth, Michigan, and he was a lawyer before the war. He was commissioned in the Marine Corps Reserves, served in the occupation of Iceland, as well as the invasion of Guadalcanal. And he was the executive officer for the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Marines, for the Okinawa invasion. He led a successful night attack against Japanese positions on Sugarloaf Hill and was killed at the end of that action, and he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor. USS Halliburton, active from 1984 to 2014, was an Oliver Hazard Perry class frigate built at Todd Pacific Shipyards in Washington. 4,200 tons, 226 crew, also carried 2 helicopters. After a quiet beginning to a career that was remarkably photogenic, shown here with the USS Iowa, also gives you an idea of the scale of a World War II battleship versus a Cold War era frigate. It had some interesting later career, serving as one of the escort ships in the middle there for the 200th birthday of the USS Constitution, and that's when the Constitution, 200 years old, mind you, sailed under her own power at this big to-do up in off of Boston. In 2009, was one of the ships that responded to the pirate takeover of the motor vessel Maersk, Alabama, later commemorated in a movie. It was decommissioned in 2014 and is actually in reserve in Philadelphia right now, awaiting transfer to the Turkish Navy. Shown here, coming back to Pearl Harbor, I believe, they frequently will put a lay on a ship when it's coming back into port. The namesake was pharmacist mate second class William Halliburton Jr., born in 1924 in Canton, North Carolina. He enlisted in the Navy Reserve, August 1943, trained at the Hospital Corps School and Field Medical School, and was part of the Okinawa invasion with the 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. He landed on the first day. On the 10th of May, he was, however, killed while shielding a wounded Marine that he was treating. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The USS Lester, another Dealey-class escort, was active from 1957 until 1953, also built at Defoe Shipbuilding in Michigan. 1,907 tons, 170 crew. It, like the Courtney, spent most of its career in anti-submarine warfare training, but in 1958, it did rescue the survivors of a sunken Italian ship off the East Coast. It trained with numerous NATO ships, and it was also decommissioned in 1973 and sold for scrap in 1974. You can see with some tinders here, it is tucked in towards the right, tin 22, that's the Lester, but you can also see there the 21, that's tin 21, so there's a bonus image of the USS Courtney for you. Namesake for the USS Lester was Hospital Apprentice First Class Fred Lester. Born in 1926 in Downers Grove, Illinois, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy Reserves in 1943 when he was 17. He trained at the Hospital Corps School and at the Field Medical School, and was assigned to the 22nd Marines, 6th Marine Division in June of 1945. He single-handedly dashed into an active battlefield, recovering a wounded Marine under fire. During that action, he was shot twice by the enemy. He recognized that his own wounds were fatal, so he directed the treatment of the other wounded Marine while refusing aid himself. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He was only 19 at the time of his death. The USNS Sgt Joseph E Mueller, active from 1945 until 1969. An interesting career for this particular ship, aside from the fact that it's named after an Army individual. It was built as a C-1 MAV-1 standard cargo ship by Southeastern Shipbuilding in Georgia. 6,000 tons, 107 crew, could only carry 100 troops though, which is small for a transport. That it also had a pretty good cargo capacity for its size. It was launched as the Waterman Steamship Company's check knot in 1945, and in 1946 was transferred to the Army as the U.S. Army Transport Sgt Joseph E Mueller. So that's why it has the Army name. It sailed several times between Japan and Korea during the occupation after World War II, and was transferred in 1949 to the Military Sealift Command, and was designated as a small transport, and was thus USNS, United States Naval Ship, Sgt Joseph E Mueller. It participated in the Korean conflict. Between 1956 and 1962, it was in reserve. But in 1962, it was converted at Maryland Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company into a NSA spy ship, which would explain all of the radio aerials that you see in this and this particular image. And that also explains its classification, TAG-171. AGs are miscellaneous auxiliaries, and that could be anything from spy ships to the USS Constitution to, nope, I'm sorry, the Constitution was an IX, but it was any sort of miscellaneous auxiliary warship that didn't fit neatly into any of the other Navy's classifications. It was out of service in 1969 and sold for scrap in 1972. The namesake was Sgt Joseph E Mueller. He was born in 1908 in Holyoke, Massachusetts, enlisted in the U.S. Army March of 1942, and was a sergeant in Company B, 305th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division for the invasion of Okinawa. He twice charged Japanese positions alone before throwing himself on a grenade to save other members of his unit. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. No insignia for this one, but an interesting ship nonetheless. The motor vessel Corporal Louis J. Hog Jr., active from 1984 to 2009, was classified as a cargo ship. This is another one of those mixed roll-on, roll-off, and container vessels, meant as a pre-positioned vessel, carrying 30 days worth of equipment and supplies for a Marine expeditionary group. It was frequently stationed in Diego Garcia, converted from the motor vessel Estelle Maersk, originally built in, I don't have that date, but that's okay. 48,000 tons, only a crew of 42, appropriate to a cargo vessel, chartered by the Navy in 1983, converted at Bethlehem Steel into a pre-positioning ship. And you can see aside from any of the other changes they made, they added a helicopter platform to the stern of the vessel. It was returned to Maersk Lines in 2009, where it served as the motor vessel Abby G for just a single year before being sold for scrap in 2010. And I've mentioned the roll-on, roll-off effect before. So here you have the Hog coming up to a plain dock. You can see that its cranes would be capable of carrying and lifting off the containers on the front there on its own, but using a ramp on the stern would be fully capable of rolling off the military vessels that it was carrying and then rolling them back on after the crisis was past. Namesake for this vessel was Corporal Louis J. Hog Jr., born 1924 in Ada, Minnesota. Before the war, he was a ship painter in Tacoma, Washington. He was drafted into the Marine Corps April in 1943 and trained as a machine gunner. He was assigned to the 1st Marines, 1st Marine Division, and saw combat on Palelilu, where he was promoted to corporal. He was killed on Okinawa, single-handedly attacking 2 Japanese guns in May of 1945. He was also posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Most of the vessels that we've talked about for both Iwo Jima and Okinawa were named for individuals who fought on the ground associated with the Army and Marine Corps, but it's interesting to look a little bit further afield. In this case, at the USS Chunghoon, a Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, commissioned in 2004 and still in active duty currently. Built at Northrop Grumman in Mississippi, 9,200 tons, 380 person crew, and there's another lay indicating that it's stationed out of Pearl Harbor. Being a relatively new ship, doesn't have a really remarkable career, except that it did serve as a host vessel for the People's Liberation Army Navy destroyer Qingdao at Pearl Harbor. And you can see the difference between those 2 different military uniforms there. That being said, as a current destroyer in the fleet, very active in the Pacific Oceans and in the South China Sea. The namesake of this vessel is Rear Admiral Gordon Chunghoon. Born in 1910 in Honolulu, Hawaii, he was the first Hawaiian American to graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1934, where he was both the halfback and punter for the Navy Academy football team, which was in 1934 the first team to beat Army in 11 tries, breaking that Army streak there. He was a lieutenant assigned to the USS Arizona in December of 1941, but was ashore during the Pearl Harbor attack. He had assignments to the Coastal Artillery and to the USS Honolulu before he was finally given command of the USS Sigsbee, DD-502 in 1944. The Sigsbee served as one of the screening vessels for the carrier task force off of the coast of Okinawa. And in April 1945, the Sigsbee was struck by a kamikaze that killed 23 sailors and sheared off 60 feet from the stern of the ship. That's 16% of the length of that vessel gone. Chunghoon refused an order to scuttle his ship as too badly damaged, and instead directed the damage control while maintaining his position and fighting the ship against other Japanese aircraft. He was awarded the Navy Cross and the Silver Star for his action. Chunghoon continued to serve in the Navy until his retirement in 1959. He was promoted to Rear Admiral on his retirement, which made him the first Asian American flag officer. He was both of Hawaiian and Chinese descent, thus first Hawaiian American, first Asian American flag officer. He had a second career as a realtor, and he passed away in 1979. But it's not just ships that are some of the more obvious legacy namings for individuals associated with the Battle of Okinawa. Marine Corps base Smedley D. Butler is a collection of facilities on Okinawa where the United States still maintains a number of military facilities. Camp Gonsalves, which is the Marine Corps Jungle Warfare Training Center, was named after Private First Class Harold Gonsalves. Camp Schwab, home of the 4th Marine Corps Regiment, is named after Private First Class Albert Schwab. Camp Hansen, which has a garrison of about 6,000 Marines from an assortment of units, as well as a NSA facility, was named after Private Dale Hansen. Camp Victorious, which is family residence on Okinawa, was named after Private Robert Miller Victorious Jr. Camp Courtney, home of the 3rd Marine Division, is named after Major Henry Courtney Jr., who we encountered. Camp Foster, home of the 3rd Medical Battalion and an airfield, it's named after Private First Class William Foster. Camp Lester, same individual we met, home to a naval hospital facility. It's named after Hospital Apprentice First Class Fred Lester. Camp Kisner, 3rd Marine Logistics Group Headquarters. It's named after Sergeant Albert Kisner. All of those camps are named after individuals who were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions at Iwo Jima. And I believe, unfortunately, all of them posthumously. But I wanted to mention some other ships. Like I said, there was a major naval combat component to Okinawa that wasn't present in Iwo Jima. And while many individuals who served in the naval battle of Okinawa have ships named after them, it's not necessarily because of their actions at Okinawa, like Admiral Chunghoon, because they served in their capacities for the entire war, but I wanted to mention some of these. For example, USS Spruance, which is now 2 ships have been named after him, was Admiral Raymond Spruance, and he was the commander of the 5th Fleet. And that was the sum total of the Navy forces in the Central Pacific in that latter part of World War II. Admiral Marc Nucup was the commander of Task Force 58, and that was the carrier strike groups that dominated the Central Pacific. And he too has had 2 vessels named after him. Admiral Arleigh Burke, the named ship for the class of destroyers, of which we've seen several during my presentations, he was the chief of staff to Nucup and Task Force 58. And he was on board both the USS Bunker Hill and the USS Enterprise when they were struck by kamikazes at the Battle of Okinawa. Admiral Richard K. Turner, namesake for the USS Richard K. Turner, was the commander of Task Force 51, And that was the Joint Expeditionary Force, all the transports and support vessels that were carrying troops and supplies for the Okinawa invasion. The USS Blandy was named after Admiral William Blandy, and he commanded Task Force 52, and that was all the support vessels, the beans and bullets that the soldiers and Marines needed for the Okinawa invasion. And the last one I'm going to mention specifically is the USS Chaffee. Now, the Chaffee was named after Senator John Chaffee from Rhode Island. He was a former Secretary of the Navy, former governor of Rhode Island, and while he was fittingly had a vessel named after him, he was also a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, the invasion of Okinawa. So not necessarily the vessel named after him as a result of his actions at Okinawa, but it's worth mentioning that he served at Okinawa, even though his rise to prominence as the Secretary of Navy and a senator merited him the naming of a vessel. And this isn't a comprehensive list, particularly because there were so many naval officers and naval vessels and heroic actions off of the coast of Okinawa. We could probably take this for several hours, but I'm not going to go that way. The last handful of ships I wanted to mention are from the other side, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. The Japanese have a different tradition of naming their vessels. They tend to name it after geographical or historical locations and then meteorological and celestial phenomenon, and not named individuals. So they don't have ships named after individuals who served in any battles, but a handful of vessels that participated in that last suicidal attack of the Japanese Imperial Navy, a handful of those ships have been commemorated with current or former vessels in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. This is the Yukikaze, the Snowstorm, and it was a destroyer in the Japanese Navy and went out of service in the late 80s or early 90s, I believe. Yukikaze was sunk at the Battle of Okinawa. Two other current destroyers in the Japanese Navy, the Suzuki, the Clear Moon, and the Fuyuzuki, the Winter Moon, both current active units in the Maritime Self-Defense Force, are named after destroyers that participated in that last battle at Okinawa. And like I said, this isn't as comprehensive as it could be, but there's a lot of vessels here that were named after notable and individuals who participated in the Battle of Okinawa. Being such a large and brutal battle, there was plenty of heroics to go around. And that's the extent of my presentation there. And I'm wondering if Tim or Jen have any questions for me.
Yeah, let's see. Let's see here. So one that we got from the Q&A on the Zoom, which there's a couple of people who are attending. One question here is, why do we scrap ships? And and then maybe you could elaborate on how we scrap ships.
Well, we scrap ships because the U.S. Navy is constantly rotating ships in and out of service. And if you've looked at the service date for some of these, a lot of them are in service for 20 years or more, sometimes only 15 years, and it will depend on the service that they've been through. If they've been in active combat duty, if they've had some sort of significant mechanical or catastrophic failure during its career, and if the Navy decides that it is redundant to their needs, that it is too old, it is too difficult, too expensive to keep up to duty, they will take it out of service and then decide if there's any other use for it. I mentioned, like with the USS Halliburton, that it was under consideration from being transferred to the Turkish Navy, and several of the Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates from the Iwo Jima presentation, same thing, transferred to another Navy. And that's because they still had some useful life left in them, and another country could use them. Alternately, aside from being scrapped, I mentioned that several of these vessels were used as target vessels, so that they were helping train the crews of current naval vessels in the actual live firing of their weapons. Occasionally, a vessel could also be sunk as an artificial reef so that coral and marine life can grow around it. This is something that they would do to a lot of vessels that they sink off the coast of Florida. But if the ship is so old, or the ship is so damaged, or the ship is simply so redundant that they have so many, other navies, they don't compare in size to the U.S. for the most part. So the fate of a lot of vessels is to be scrapped, and in which case the Navy will put out a call for contracts. Private companies, both U.S. and overseas, though I think there is some legislation preventing it from being overseas currently, will place bids to cut up the vessels for scrap. And once the vessel is being demilitarized, all of the electronics and weapons, anything useful has been taken off of it, it is towed away to a yard that will take it apart and usually recycle at this stage any of the metals that could come out of it. But that's just what they'll do to old ships. Oh, and a handful of vessels, however, may end up as museum vessels. None of the ones that I've discussed here have, but that's rare because it's so expensive to maintain a museum vessel. Though there is an entire second navy in the United States between the aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, and submarines that are museum vessels.
Awesome. Okay, so I got one here from the live chat. It says, is Camp Henson named after Hank Henson, one of the flag raisers on Iwo Jima?
No. Camp Hansen is named after Private Dale Hansen. All of the camps on Okinawa are named after individuals from Okinawa. If there is a Iwo Jima associated one, I just don't know it, which is entirely possible. Now, the overall base is named after General Smedley Butler, and he's a Marine who won the Medal of Honor twice, not posthumously, most amazing enough, but he was a Banana War and World War I vet rather than a World War II vet. The smaller camps that are components to the larger base, those are all named after Medal of Honor winners for Okinawa.
Cool. And so while we wait on some other questions from live chat, as well as people who are attending via Zoom, I had a question related to Medal of Honors. So how many Medal of Honors were there in Okinawa versus Iwo Jima?
So if I'm remembering correctly, there were 23 Medal of Honors awarded at Okinawa and 27 at Iwo Jima. And I believe we had a question last week about Iwo Jima. Was that the highest percentage, given number of troops deployed or anything like that? I don't know. It would take a little while to sit down with the math and figure it out. That is certainly a very high concentration of Medals of Honor awarded in an action in World War II. But in terms of the most awarded for a single action, you have to go back to the Civil War, and I believe like the Battle of Shiloh had 211 Medal of Honors. But this is there's a difference in the standard for awarding the Medal of Honor in the Civil War and the awarding of Medal of Honor in the 20th century. Sure, valorous action is definitely an important component of that, and I do not mean at all to diminish the achievements of the Civil War awardees, but it's just a slightly different standard by World War II. So Okinawa 23, Iwo Jima 27.
Great. I've got one here from Eddie. It said, I heard about Operation 10 Go, and they said that was the Japanese last 10 ships. Is that true? They only had 10 ships left in the Navy?
No. So now I got to look it up. So operation is obviously an English word, but oh, my screen's not going to let me do that. Tim, maybe you could look that up and see what the translation of Tengo is.
Sure.
There were 10 Japanese warships involved in that operation, a battleship, a light cruiser, and then 8 destroyers. But they weren't the last 10 ships in the Navy. They were probably the last 10 really well combat prepared vessels. There were several other vessels that were motive and capable of fighting, but this was the last gasp for the major surface combatants, the Yamato being that, because the Japanese, a handful of other Japanese major combatants managed to survive the war because they were expended in the atomic tests at Bikini Atoll. Yamato was definitely the last major combatant that the Japanese had, though, that was in combat or near 100% combat readiness.
I'm trying to find what Tengo would mean in Japanese.
Go means 5, actually, but it could be a context thing.
Yeah, so like Tengo together, it says is like a boy's name. Yeah, I have no knowledge of Japanese, and I will not pretend I do. So we'll have to figure that out later. But I guess it's safe to say that it wasn't referring to the number of ships.
No, it wasn't referring to the number of ships. Let me take one stab at it. Heaven 1. That's what it meant. Operation Heaven 1. So it was a code name. We see, when originally these 2 presentations were supposed to be part of a larger one-day only event live at the museum for the 75th anniversary of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And we actually were going to have a table display, a section on the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it was going to include Operation Tengo.
Great. Well, that looks like that's all of the questions from our various sources. So why don't you sign us out there, Mark?
Thank you so much for watching my presentation and watching a Mariners Museum presentation in general. It is nice to know that there are still people out there engaging with us about history, because without an audience, we're just talking to ourselves, and that gets old really fast. So thank you very much for attending today. I genuinely appreciate it.